Hello, everyone. I'm Andre Bailey, and I am the CEO of Rethinking Homelessness. We're so glad that you could join us on our webinar on the eviction crisis, preparing for the coming eviction crisis, how the new stimulus dollars impact your community. Again, I'm Andre Bailey, CEO of Rethinking Homelessness, and we're going to take 1 hour to really talk to you about this crisis and how you can make the biggest impact possible in your community. We have people logging on right now, and so we're going to dive in head first. If you have questions, please feel free to put questions in the chat box. Some of you have submitted questions, and I'm going to ask my team to get my PowerPoint going because it's not clicking. That's all right. You can't have a webinar without some technical difficulty. So now, go ahead and switch back and forth at times, guys, so they see me and the PowerPoint. So let's get started and talk a little bit about, Rethinking Homelessness. Again, many of you know us. We work with mayors, law enforcement officials, United Ways, continuums of care, business communities around the country. Okay. That's who we are. And let me just mention this going in. We got a lot of people logging on. We have hundreds and hundreds of mayors, county leaders, others, that we're going to be doing a 6-week in-depth program for cities, counties, and other community leaders on the eviction crisis. That's going to start up the first week of February. We'll get you more information on that later. But this is a 1-hour webinar. We're going to throw the kitchen sink at you. We want you to be able to help as many people as possible. I'll talk more about this later, but we're going to have a 6-week in-depth program starting February 3rd on this eviction crisis as well. Let's see, next slide. So before we have our special guests on, which are Diane Yentel, President and CEO of the National Low Income Housing Coalition, and Barbara Poppe, former director of the United States Interagency Council on Homelessness. Let's talk a little bit about how communities can impact the eviction crisis, but what does that eviction crisis look like? Number one, you guys know these stats. I don't need to reiterate all of them, but I think it's important just to set the stage. We have an eviction crisis. 40% of renter households are at risk of eviction. Nearly 1/3 of tenants didn't pay some or part of their rent in 2020. And there's over 11 million evictions that will be filed sometime as eviction moratoriums sunset. This is an old number, 21.5 billion. The newest number I was told is that the total amount of past due rent is closing in on $39 billion, and some have estimates even higher. We've seen the eviction crisis. You're seeing it in your community. What do communities do about it? So that's important. Here's something else very important. Looking at the number of disenfranchised populations in your communities, Black, Latinos, and others, low-income minority households are at greatest risk of eviction. We all have seen United Way, great organization, their ALICE study. They, along with other experts, estimate that 80% of those facing eviction are people of color. Black and Latinos are highest groups represented there. Low-income women, especially poor women of color, have the highest risk of eviction. And so this is important because everyone out there, I'm going to say a few things that are critically important today. And here's one of them. You got to take the money that's coming in right now. We're going to talk about the $25 billion that Congress just set aside on this eviction crisis. Many of you, you're already have put in your request for that money. I know communities over 200,000. You had to put in your request or putting it in right now. That money should be to you in the next 2 weeks. Some of you have already started to receive it. As you're starting to receive these funds, you've got to look at targeting, and we're going to talk about that today. Barb Poppe is going to talk about that a lot as well. So before we have Diane Yentel and Barb Poppe come on, let's look at what this new stimulus, the numbers behind it. Some of you already know this, but I want to reiterate this again as well. Diane Yentel's organization, the National Low Income Housing Coalition, they have a lot of assets. If you haven't seen them, we'll send them to you. I'm sure you've seen most of them, talking about how this $25 billion is allocated. Most of you are already starting to figure out what your allocation is going to be. It's really 23.8 billion when you start backing out some of the money that was set aside for tribal areas that got a separate allotment of money. It's a lot of money, but I do want to remind you folks, that the original HEROES Act was calling for $150 billion in rental assistance. What we wound up with is 25 billion. So as this money starts coming in, it's going to have to really last. We're hoping that a new Congress, a new president, there's going to be more money available, but we don't know that. So we've got $25 billion and it's going to be allocated, and we have the information on how your community is going to get money if you don't already have it. And again, a few important stimulus facts from the National Low Income Housing Coalition and some of their materials. And let me just run through these really quickly. Number one, total amount 25 billion. Number two, funds have changed and now they're going to be distributed not just to 500,000 or more, but 200,000 or more. A lot of you already know that. This is critically important. Now we're going to get into the details that are critically important. 90% of this funds must be used for rental assistance, but 10% could and should be used for administration. What does that look like? What should you be thinking about? 10% of this money should be used to partner with groups like United Way or 211 or continuums of care. Some of you are going to, as counties or cities, you're going to administer your own programs, but you do have 10% of these dollars to cover the cost of administering these programs out. You could also allocate some of that money internally if you need to, but there's 10% that you can use, very important, for attorney's fees, for all kinds of overhead dollars. That's critical because this gives a lot more flexibility for communities as they're looking to move forward with their plan. Now, this is great, and we're going to get to Diane Yentel, President and CEO of the National Low Income Housing Coalition, in just a minute, and she'll tell you a lot more about some of these facts, very important facts on the eviction crisis and the stimulus dollars. But we're going to talk today about how now this stimulus and these dollars, how they're positioned to where really they push communities, if you kind of implement it the way it's written, to pay more back rent than forward rent, because it only allows you a 3-month allocation at any one given time in forward rent, but does not specify the back rent. We think this is very important because if you're not careful, again, you're going to take large allotments of money. You might settle 6 or 9 months of back rent, only settle 3 months of rent, and that tenant may be right back facing eviction just a few months from now. So we want to talk to you a little bit about targeting and how to, if you find folks that are most in need, you want to be able to target them and have them already in the queue, designate funds so that they get 3 months and then they're going to be already set up for another 3 months. But you can only give them 3 months to start. Funds can be used for 80% of AMI, but I saw an article on this today that was really, the spirit of it was inaccurate. This legislation really asks you to target 50% AMI first, and then you could, in theory, use the 80%. So we're going to get all into that, but it's my pleasure to introduce Diane Yentel. Diane, are you there? Can you hear me? We're gonna see if we can get her on here. Diane is the president and CEO of the National Low Income Housing Coalition. They are the group that has really worked to be advocates for this crisis on an ongoing basis. Let's see. Do we have Diane on yet?
I'm here.
Oh, look at that. It's a miracle. Now, I will tell you, Diane, you cannot do a webinar without the technology crashing at least.
Of course.
So, but we're all entering into a new world of technology. Again, Diane Yentel, did I pronounce your last name correctly, Diane?
Yes, thank you.
Awesome. President and CEO, National Low Income Housing Coalition. In my opinion, they're putting out some of the best materials and talking points and advocacy around on this eviction crisis to communities. Again, Diane, President, CEO, they are a membership organization dedicated solely to achieving socially just public policy on housing. And Diane is a veteran of affordable housing policy. Diane, take it away. I am here and I'm going to move your slides forward as you ask me to. So feel free to boss me around, and thank you for joining us.
Okay, great. Well, thanks so much for having me. And I can see already a lot of great questions coming in to the Q&A box. And so I am going to kind of zip through some of my slides, especially the ones that are more introductory, so we can get into some of the meat of how the funds will be spent. So you can do my first slide, please, for me. So, you know, to really recognize the crisis that we're facing now with evictions and back rent owed, we have to recognize where we were prior to COVID-19, which was in the midst of a severe affordable housing crisis, where we had a shortage of 7 million apartments affordable and available to the lowest income renters. So another way of saying that same number is for every 10 of the lowest income renters, there were fewer than 4 apartments affordable and available to them. And you can see from this map, and you know from your communities, that the shortage ranges from most severe to least severe, but there is no state and there is no community that has a sufficient number of homes for its lowest income renters. And this is why we have homelessness in many communities today. Next slide, please. So when you have such limited income to begin with, and you're paying so much of it towards your rent, you know, prior to COVID-19, we had about 10 million renter households paying at least half of their income towards rent, and many paying much more. So when you have such limited income, you're always one financial shock away from missing rent, facing eviction, and in worst cases, becoming homeless. So for many of these same renters, COVID-19 and the financial fallout from it is that financial shock. You know, they've lost hours at work, they've lost wages, it's harder than ever for them to cobble together what they need in order to make rent. Next slide, please. So if we had a system in our country to catch people when they fall off of a financial cliff of any sort, but especially one like the financial fallout from COVID-19, if we had such a system, we would be better equipped to manage the housing needs of renters today. But of course, we don't have such a system in our country. What we have is a housing lottery system where only 1 in every 4 households who needs assistance and is eligible for it receives any. So 75% of the people who need housing assistance don't get it. They wait in line. They're adding their names to years or sometimes decades-long waiting lists, hoping to win what is essentially a housing lottery system. So that lack of a social safety net and that severe affordable housing crisis pre-COVID has led now to tens of millions of renters at risk of losing their apartments during COVID-19. There were a number of resources and protections that were put in place early on in the pandemic through the CARES Act and through a patchwork of federal, state, and local eviction protections, extended unemployment insurance, stimulus checks, you know, all of that together kept many people housed. And until just last month, the last remaining protection that was in place to prevent a tsunami of evictions was the federal CDC eviction moratorium, which was set to expire at the end of December and now is extended through the end of January. So at this point, after many of those original resources were depleted, there are estimates that at this time, low-income renters owe anywhere between $30 billion and $70 billion in back rent, clearly more than they can pay off in their lifetimes. Next slide, please. So it's also important to recognize that in this moment that this is what structural racism looks like, right? We have had in our country decades of racist housing and transportation policies that purposefully put homeownership out of reach for many Black Americans, creating the yawning generational wealth gap that exists today. This creates tremendous disparities in housing and homelessness. So African-American people are disproportionately likely to be renters. People of color are disproportionately likely to be rent burdened. They're disproportionately likely to be extremely low income. They're disproportionately likely to experience homelessness. And certainly these inequities are compounding the harm done by COVID-19. So it's really important to recognize this and to recommit to ensuring that these tens of billions of dollars now that are flowing into communities across the country are certainly not exacerbating racial inequities, but that we're actually using them to advance racial equity. And we do that when it comes to the $25 billion in emergency rental assistance by targeting it to the lowest income people, the most marginalized people. Doing that alone helps advance racial equity. Next slide, please. So the solutions to all of this from early in the COVID-19 have been, pretty obvious and pretty easy, and it's pretty simple, even if they're not easy, right? Protect and house people who are homeless, ensure that tens of millions more don't become homeless, address the underlying housing shortage, and center racial equity in all of the work. Next slide, please. So, as I said early on in the pandemic, there were resources to create emergency rental assistance programs around the country, and we have been tracking all of them. So at last count, there were 552 emergency rental assistance programs that are in existence today at the state and local level. They account for a total of about $4.5 billion, most of which is funding from the CARES Act, some of which is other funding. About 40 to 45% of these programs have already shut down because funding has been depleted or demand just overran capacity. And now, at the end of 2020, we got another COVID relief package, and it enacted and will allocate $25 billion in emergency rental assistance, as you were hearing earlier. So these emergency rental assistance programs that already exist are some of the programs that will now be infused with these new dollars. These are the communities that will likely be quickest to get the money out to renters and landlords when they receive their allocation, because some of the infrastructure already exists. The other thing we can see from this map is the places where there may be limited capacity, and there may be communities that have to kind of start from scratch to stand up emergency rental assistance programs. And those are the places where it may take a little bit longer to get that money out. But we have been not just tracking the programs, but learning from them and pulling out what are some of the mistakes that have been made that we want to make sure aren't repeated, and what are some of the best practices, what's worked really well that other communities can learn from. And so we just today published a new report, which I'll put in the chat box afterwards, on best practices for state and local emergency rental assistance programs that I hope you'll all take a look at, so you can learn from what's worked and what hasn't in other communities as you think about standing up emergency rental assistance programs in your own. The other thing that we're working on that happens next, and that will be really important for all of you to know about, is guidance that will come out from Treasury about how to utilize these emergency rental assistance dollars. There's a lot of specificity in the law. So my hope, and I would urge communities to start spending these dollars when you get them, which may be as soon as next week, and will certainly be by the week after. But there are some areas that additional guidance will be needed, and Treasury is starting to put that together. We have sent them a letter, which I'll also put in the chat box, with really comprehensive recommendations for what we believe need to be in this guidance. And the framing of those recommendations are mostly about, one, making sure that the money gets to the people who need it the most, to prevent evictions. So that is the lowest income people and the most marginalized people. And we have a number of recommendations there. And then the other set of recommendations is to everywhere else simplify as much as possible. And we're urging the Department of Treasury to let states and localities know that they can use self-certification for any kind of documentation that would otherwise be required, to try to simplify so that the money can get out very quickly. So we know that the Department of Treasury is starting to work on some guidance. The transition team is starting to work on some guidance. The timing of it, I'd say, is uncertain. Next slide, please. And then just very last things that I'll say before we have some questions is, one, certainly this is not enough. Much more is going to be needed. First order of business is to further extend the eviction moratorium, which now expires in just 2 weeks. So we're urging President-elect Biden on his first day in office to issue a new executive order with an extended, a strengthened, and an enforced eviction moratorium. And then for he and Congress to get back to work on the next COVID relief package, which may start as soon as next week. And there we are going to urge for more funding for emergency rental assistance and longer term funding to start to address some of those underlying housing shortages. Next slide, please. And then it's a new day when it comes to possibilities for really comprehensive solutions to truly address that underlying housing crisis that has been long-standing. So we're going to work with President-elect Biden and the incoming Congress to start to achieve really substantial increases in funding for vouchers, for public housing, for the National Housing Trust Fund, as well as a number of renter protections that need to be in place, all of which will help us resolve the underlying housing crisis to end homelessness and ensure that we don't face this same challenge again during the next pandemic or even just during the next year. So we have our work cut out for us, but we really have a lot of opportunities ahead. First order of business is to get that money out as quickly as possible and to the people who need it the most. Next order of business is to get more. So I'll stop there, and then I'm happy to answer any questions that come in.
Thank you so much. Diane, thank you so much. Let me just go into a couple of questions. I have a question first, and then we've got about 5 or 6 questions to follow up from those that are on. Over 600 communities are on right now, so thank you so much if you're out there and working on this. Diane, my first question would be, what would you say the pitfalls are for communities that receive this money? What are the 1 or 2 big pitfalls that mistakes, if you will, that communities make that you'd caution them to think about? Maybe let me put the question one different way. All these communities, as you showed before, 552 of them had programs. What did we learn from the CARES Act money that communities should look to try to do or avoid doing with this new money? 1 or 2 things that you really are recommending.
Sure. So, of those 550 programs that exist today, I would say that most of them did well and got the money out pretty quickly and got it to the people who need it the most. Of those who didn't do well, there were kind of 2 sets of problems that existed. One was capacity issues. So there were certainly communities where, there was only 1 or maybe 2 staff people able to work on this, and then just overwhelmed by applications and literally not enough hours in the day to go through them all and get the money out. That slowed things down in a lot of communities. So I think advising communities now to think about how to build up that capacity and to think about, as Andre said earlier, that 10% in administrative dollars that you have available to you for how you can build that capacity, even thinking about regional approaches and thinking about multi-city approaches to be able to address capacity issues. The other set of challenges that we saw were places where, the way I would put it is, state legislatures or city councils or program administrators overburdened themselves with bureaucracy. So either they added on additional restrictions for use of the funds, they added on additional eligibility requirements, they had unreasonably long application processes, all of which slowed it down. So that's where I would just really advise to simplify, focus on the income targeting piece, focus on outreach to marginalized communities, make sure this money is getting to the people who need it the most. Beyond that, simplify everywhere you can. Use self-certification where you can, rather than requiring burdensome proof, and understanding that this is sometimes out of the hands of the program administrators, but really advocating at the local level to make sure that the state and city don't add any new bureaucratic layers to this, because every new layer is going to slow down getting the money out.
Diane, Faye from South Carolina asks, this is a good segue to something you just said, what are the most important aspects of targeting marginalized or previously disenfranchised communities? What do communities need to focus on to make sure that happens? Because one of the things we talked about in a previous webinar, Diane, was that roughly 50% of some of the programs we surveyed had no income real eligibility process. They weren't doing targeting. 44% of the programs in a recent study were shown to not do targeting at all. So how does a community balance speed and targeting? What's your advice to them?
Yeah, so my advice there is to not think of that as an either or, speed or targeting. And if you do, to think of the targeting being the more important. So clearly we want to prevent evictions. This money's not going to get out quickly enough to prevent evictions unless that federal eviction moratorium is extended. So that's like a different set of problems. We're going to work on getting that federal eviction moratorium extended so there's more time and use that time to make sure that the money gets to the people who need it the most. And the ways to do that, one is deeper income targeting. So, the law does require eligibility is set at 80% or below area median income. As Andre said earlier, there's a preference or a priority required for people who are 50% or below. We're urging Treasury to further define that 50% priority and put in place deeper required income targeting. And that's a place where I would encourage states and localities to do so as well. Set aside a certain percent, we recommend about 40%, for extremely low income renters, knowing that it will take a little longer to get that money out because it requires more outreach, but knowing then that that money is getting to the people who need it the most. And then thinking about the outreach that's required, thinking about especially Black, Indigenous people of color, immigrant communities, LGBTQ communities, and what kind of partnerships you can create at the local level where the trust is already there to be able to reach out to those communities and ensure that they are applying for these funds. And then the last thing I'll say, just a quick tip too, is recognizing that these funds are not going to be enough to meet all of the needs in many communities. And so it is likely, so there will have to be some way to prioritize who gets limited funds. And usually the way communities do that is either a lottery or a first come, first served. And when it comes to those two choices, a lottery, and ideally a weighted lottery that prioritizes by income or marginalized status, is the most equitable way to do it. First come, first served gets the money to the people who are least marginalized and have the most access to internet, to community services. So don't do first come, first served. Do a weighted lottery if you have to find a way to get limited income with more demand than you have resources for.
Yeah, we're going to be hearing, we're talking to Diane Yentel, President and CEO of the National Low Income Housing Coalition. Diane, we're going to be talking to Barb Poppe. I know you know Barb well.
Great.
In a few minutes. And Barb, in a previous webinar we did, talked a lot about, really making sure that you're figuring out how to do the targeting, and that fast lotteries, although they're fast, are going to ensure that the people least in need get these limited funds. I'll also say that she was talking about the idea that without that targeting, you're ultimately these funds are going to run out before the people who need them most get them. So that's such a great point. We have another question. Diane, you have a few more minutes that you can hang out with us? So
Sure.
okay,
Yes.
so we have a bunch of people asking. Peg from East Hampton is one of them, about communities, small municipalities under 200,000. Any special advice for communities under 200,000 because of the restriction went from 500 to 200, but now there's a lot of communities under 200,000 saying, what do we do? How do we work in our community? What's your advice to small municipalities?
Right, so those small municipalities are not eligible for a direct allocation of these funds, but can certainly, the residents of those municipalities can and should be eligible for the state allocation of funds. So I would say, I would advise small municipalities wherever possible to really be working closely on the state allocation and how that program is designed to ensure that people in your locality are eligible and can access those funds. And similarly, to think about a regional approach, looking at the other localities or cities with populations over 200,000 in the region, and similarly reaching out and working with them to ensure that residents of your locality are eligible for those programs as well.
Wonderful. Vicki from Hinesville, Georgia was asking about best practices. What are the best practices in working with your landlords in a community or a region? Any advice from the National Low Income Housing Coalition on best practices in working with landlords? Because we do, I'll tell you, we do feel for landlords, especially many landlords that have just a handful of properties. A lot of them are not bad people and are struggling to not struggle themselves financially. What's your advice to how communities should target and work with landlords?
Sure. So a few ways to answer that. And absolutely, I mean, from the start, we've been making the case that this emergency rental assistance is needed for those low-income tenants to avoid saddling them with more debt than they can pay off, and for small landlords who rely on rental income to pay their bills. The way the legislation is written is that landlords can apply for the funding themselves. They can partner with tenants to apply for the funding. When they apply for the funding directly, they have to do it in partnership with the tenant. And that's a protection there for the tenant to make sure that that funding that the landlord receives goes to pay that tenant's back rent, and that tenant stays housed as a result. So there will, in some cases, ideally be a partnership there. There'll be a co-application from tenant and landlord. There's also a protection. So I don't think landlord outreach will be a challenge. I'd be really interested in hearing from any of you now or offline whether it is. But I think generally speaking, landlords are going to know how and apply for these funds themselves. There's also a protection for tenants that if landlords refuse to participate, that the funding can go directly to tenants. And that's a place too where we have learned a lesson in California and North Carolina and some other places where, for good reason, localities wanted to add extra restrictions for the landlord to receive the funds in the form of renter rights and renter protection. So, in order for the landlord to receive the fund, they couldn't evict for some period of time, or they couldn't raise the rent for some period of time. What we found was that some landlords, and not a small number, refused to participate. They would rather eat the cost of that back rent and walk away from the program than take that check and agree to those requirements, which of course harms the tenants. So there too, again, we would just advise, as few restrictions as possible on these funds, including additional requirements for landlords.
Dan, one more question for you. And again, thank you for taking the time to talk to our leaders today. You're so knowledgeable and passionate about this. But Vicki from Southern California asks about the 3-month restriction on forward rental payments. How does this 3-month restriction limit a community's rental assistance program? And basically, she's asking, she had a long question here, but she's basically asking, it seems like the way this stimulus legislation is written, it almost pushes a community to settle more back rent than pay forward rent. Are you hearing any best practices or advice for communities on that restriction?
Yeah, it's
Restriction?
problematic, and I would say that's by design. I mean, you hit it on the nail on the head, and certainly not what we fought for, but by design, there were some members of Congress, especially some Republican members, who did want to have most of these funds go to pay back rent and wanted much more restriction on the uses for forward rent. So as you probably know, it certainly can be used for forward rent. It can be used for a total of 12 months and even up to 15 months of total assistance if needed. But when using it for forward rent, it requires kind of a recertification every 3 months. And that's not ideal, because that's just, again, more bureaucracy, more capacity needed by the program administrator, and more burden on the tenant to keep coming back. It's an unfortunate part of the program that we'll have to work with and figure out best ways to manage. And it's also on our list, I will just say, of potential changes, legislative fixes that we might try to get in a next COVID relief package to, again, just reduce some of the burdens on the administrators, on the landlords, and on the tenants here.
Yeah, Diane, one of the things that we are urging communities to think about is it says you can only allocate them 3 months at a time, but in no place in the legislation does it not say that you couldn't, in essence, pre-commit them. If you use targeting, if you know you have limited funds, you could find the most vulnerable, settle some back rent, whatever that might be, get the 3 months, but then have the communication with both the renter and the landlord that that person has been designated, whatever terminology you want to use, for another allotment, so it doesn't go back into so those landlords don't and tenants don't have to start back at square one. In my opinion, in our organization's opinion, the 3 month limitation is very problematic, and I think you're saying the same thing. So
yeah, agreed.
Diane Yentel, President, CEO of the National Low Income Housing Coalition. Diane, with your kind of final comments, how can people get more information from your organization? How can they connect with you guys if they want to partner with you?
Well, you can go to our website, which is www.nlihc.org. You can find my contact information there. You can find contact information for our whole team. And you can find all of the information that we have about the program and all of the advocacy we're doing around the program. You can also join at any time. We do weekly national calls on Mondays from 2:30 to 4 on coronavirus, housing, and homelessness. This is a top of mind issue for those calls. And then those are very large calls. We usually have 600 to 2,000 people on those calls. And then also every Wednesday at 3 o'clock, we have smaller state and local implementation calls, where right now, pretty much all we're talking about is this pot of money and how it gets out, and hearing from each other about problems and challenges and troubleshooting. So please connect in with us through our website, reach out to me directly, and I'd be happy to plug you in wherever it's most useful for your work.
Diane Yentel, President, CEO, National Low Income Housing Coalition. Diane, thank you so much for being here. There's so many questions. We're gonna answer a lot of those questions offline. Thank you so much for joining us. Let me move ahead now.
Thanks. Bye.
Thank you so much. Let me move ahead now to just a couple other things. We're going to hear from Barb Poppe. Don't you jump off this webinar. Barb Poppe's coming on in just a minute. I talked about this a minute ago. Diane stressed it. If you're going to do a lottery, don't do a lottery unless you're targeting first, and then that lottery is of those who have been targeted. Let me move on. This is keep putting your questions in the chat box. We're going to come back to questions in just a minute. I'm so honored to have Barb Poppe here. She's fantastic. She's a former executive director of the U.S. Interagency Council on Homelessness. And she helped put together a lot of the strategies during our last housing crisis as a part of the Obama administration. Very familiar with the Biden administration. We're so excited to have her.
Great. Well, it's great to be here with all of you, colleagues across the country. Today, I think all of you know my work with the Obama administration and the U.S. Interagency Council on Homelessness and Opening Doors. Since I left the administration in 2014, I've been doing independent consulting. I had a chance to work with Andre on a number of great projects in Florida, but also I'm sure many of you on the call have had a chance to see you since I've left the Obama administration. But today, what I want to talk with you about, and Andre had invited me, is to help you begin to think through how you're going to use the 25 billion CRF dollars through this new allocation of funding. And so specifically, what are the things we know about designing an effective emergency rental assistance program? And I think what Andre's data has shown so far is that one is the need is going to be greater than you're going to have resources for. And second, that the programs that are out there so far have largely not been sufficiently targeted to actually, probably in many cases, prevent homelessness. They've been targeted, they haven't been targeted and have been widely available. And as Andre said, we want to be sure these resources get to the households that have the greatest needs or experiencing the greatest hardships, keep them stable in their housing. So this presentation really speaks to what are the key elements as you think through that. So let's go ahead with the next slide then, Andre. I've been doing some work with some really smart people, including the National Low Income Housing Coalition, which Andre's been sharing their work. Our good friends at the National Alliance to End Homelessness, the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities, National Innovation Services, National Healthcare for the Homeless Council, the Urban Institute, and then my good friend and colleague, Matthew Doherty, who is also a former executive director of the U.S. Interagency Council. And the work we've been doing for the last 9 months is under the framework for an equitable COVID-19 homelessness response. And I want to encourage all of you, if you haven't checked out the materials and presentations that we've developed, I want to encourage you to go to this website and look at that. It comprehensively addresses local community responses to homelessness under COVID-19 with an eye toward how to make that response equitable.
Barbara, we'll send everyone those links right after the webinar.
That is great. Thank you, Andre. So some of the work I'm going to talk about in the next few slides comes from that work that we have collectively been doing through the framework project. So let's move on to the next one. Thank you. So I think as the purpose of this webinar and the work that Andre has been promoting is that obviously you have to use your new funds strategically and wisely. This is not a chance to just throw money around because there's so many people with great needs. And the first is we really are encouraging the communities take a really strong focus on how are you going to advance racial justice and equity. You do not want to use these dollars that repeat the past patterns of disadvantaging households of color, disadvantaging female heads of household and people with disabilities. We want to see that you're really advancing equity. To do that, you need to address the highest needs first. This is incredibly important. You obviously are going to need to grow partnerships because this is going to take all of us to prevent the tsunami of evictions and growing homelessness. And so having those partnerships you've had in the past, but also it's an opportunity to build new partnerships. Definitely got to stay focused on getting people into housing, keeping them in housing. That is the most important result that we're trying to obtain here. And you have to act quickly. So this is not the time for long-term strategic planning. This is the time to really act as quickly as you can, modify your strategies as you go forward, but have an eye toward great urgency. One good thing that's in the bill, in addition to the 25 billion, is the eviction moratorium is extended through the end of January. So there's another kind of a relief break that we have where that many evictions are being prevented. And so we've got to try to get these dollars out and in place at least by the end of January. There is hopes, I think, under a new administration, new Congress, there might be some extensions to that because that eviction moratorium has been so effective. But nonetheless, we got to act quickly. Next slide. So when we think about designing an emergency rental assistance program, what I'd encourage you to do is there's three most important things to do. First is you don't want to focus your efforts on those who are most likely to succeed. Those who are most likely to succeed are most likely to succeed on their own, and they have high levels of resiliency. They have far more resources than if you are working on the folks who are least likely to succeed, and but for this will fall into homelessness, be evicted, or end up on your street. So have that as your first criteria. And this is historically the practice that prevention programs across the country have been, is they've been very good at creaming, and they target the resources to households who, for just a little bit of assistance, we can prevent it. You're going to see really high success rates of prevention of 95% and above. Well, that's because they're targeting the resources to the people who largely probably don't need it, could make it through. Not to say there wouldn't be suffering. So you've got to have that is not the focus of your program, is to help those most likely to succeed. The second is you really want to focus in your communities, given that you're, the audience we have here, your COCs, your United Ways, your 211s, you know that preventing homelessness is incredibly important. So when you do that, the best way to target is, first of all, make sure that people who have a prior history of homelessness have the highest priority. They are the most likely to become homeless. You want to focus on extremely low incomes. As Andre said, the legislation has tiers at 50% and 80%. We would say that you need to target most of your resources to households who are at extremely low income, 30% of area median income and below, roughly the poverty level. So target to the lowest incomes. And those who are living in the neighborhoods who have the greatest risk factors. I'm going to talk a little bit about how you can identify those neighborhoods. And you need to be prepared to address both arrearages as well as going forward needs, because we want to stabilize these households so they don't fall into homelessness. And the third is, given the population who is most at risk of homelessness and being evicted, you really want to have strong relationships and invest in those programs that are led by people of color and that serve the target population, and being sure that they are included in the design and implementation of rental assistance programs. If we don't have those players at the table, we are not going to design local interventions that get to the population who has the greatest need and is greatest risk. So those are our 3 top tips. Next slide. And so one of the ways that you can figure out where you can geographically target your rental assistance, and this is really important, is we know where the greatest risk population is. We know which zip codes they live in. And the Urban Institute has created this tool that you can use. And as you can see, you can search either at your county level or you can search at your continuum of care level. And for this example, I put in Fort Myers, Cape Coral, Lee County, COC, and you can see just at a glance, the neighborhoods that are the darkest colors are the places where you want to be sure that you've identified programs, that you may be prioritizing households who live in those zip codes because they are the most likely to be evicted and the most likely to experience homelessness. So you don't have to target, you don't have to have a county-wide rental assistance program. You could offer a very targeted assistance program based on this geography. Next slide. This is, this time the data poll was for Hartford, Connecticut, just to give you another community to look at. And what is interesting is when we pair this up to the historic redlining that has been done in communities, you can see that we know where these communities are because there has historically been disinvestment. So we are trying, through providing the emergency rental assistance in these districts and these areas with the highest risk factors, this helps us to address racial equity because we are investing in the places where there's been historic disinvestment. And this is a way to address racial disparities. And you can target these dollars specifically to these geographies, either to the people who live in them or to the organizations that are based and are doing strong work in those areas. This tool is super easy to use. I've looked at several different communities and lenses. I really encourage you to take a look at this and see how you can define and design your emergency rental assistance to prioritize these communities with the greatest number of risk factors. Next slide. And then the other considerations as you are designing your emergency rental assistance are to give some thought to special populations. We know in COVID-19 that pregnant women older adults and others with specific health conditions have adverse outcomes related to COVID-19. And it is worth trying to prioritize assistance to these households, because should they become homeless, should they lose their housing, they are more likely to contract and to have poor outcomes related to COVID-19. So you can add some prioritization there. Also would suggest that even though legal assistance is not a focus of the rental assistance, be sure you are partnering up with your legal assistance providers and trying to leverage those relationships, because we know that most people who are evicted are not represented by legal counsel, and nearly all landlords are. So you're trying to level the playing field. So don't forget about partnering with legal assistance, because not all landlords are good actors, and you need some legal help there. And then the third is you really are going to have to lean into and leverage mainstream resources and benefits for the long-term sustainability. So as you provide any services related to this, you want to be sure that folks are connected to income support programs. They know, how to increase their benefits. They're taking advantage of any of the other federal programs that are out there under either the coronavirus response or just locally. But don't forget to try to stabilize the households together with these other resources for long-term sustainability. All right, and next slide. So this is just my my concluding remarks. I'm going to encourage all of you to go back and to use the framework more broadly. The work that we've done under the equitable framework covers everything from unsheltered homelessness to the crisis response to eviction prevention work that we're discussing here today. But I encourage you to look at the materials that we've complied and the tools. There's some great equitable decision-making tools that National Innovation Services has put together. There's just a lot of great content. It's completely free to you all to use. Please use it, and feel free to reach back to me if you have any questions on how to use that. So with that, last slide. This is how you can feel free to reach out to me, and I can make you some connections. We really, really want to see that this emergency rental assistance is targeted effectively so that we prevent not just a tsunami of evictions, but we prevent the tsunami of homelessness, because we do not want to see rising numbers of people having to live on the streets and overwhelming the shelters across America. So thank you all for being our partners in this good work. And I'm going to turn it back over to Andre.
Barbara, thank you so much. For those of you, again, that don't know, Barbara Poppe is such a national treasure, worked for the Obama administration and worked with President-elect Biden during the 2008 housing crisis. So we have Barb's recording, everything she just talked about. We have it recorded and we can send it out to your community. Thank you so much, Barb Poppe. All right, with our last 7 minutes, I just want to answer a few questions and talk about a few next steps. Number one, kind of, big questions and next steps. Let me just encourage you right now. Build a partnership as this money's coming in between your stakeholder groups, your top leaders in the community, and your United Way 211 Continuum of Care and other agencies. I encourage you so much. So many of you work in the housing homelessness space already. Some of you don't. You don't want to leave these folks out of the conversation. And some of your communities are best served by using that 10% of administrative dollars, contracting with your local United Way, your local 211, your Continuum of Care. You want to look at building those partnerships quickly. The cities and the counties are going to have the money, and these agencies, convene them, get a Zoom out as soon as possible with all your stakeholders as quickly as you can. Next, make sure, again, you understand there different cities, different counties, different states. The eviction moratorium dates are moving. They're a moving target. Make sure you're up to date on that. And this slide right here, please, please, please screenshot this slide. We really believe that you need to take the time right now to look at the collaborative in your community around your eviction prevention program. And this is just a roughshod slide, if you will, but look at working directly with your landlords, a program that's communicating and working directly with them. working at the same time with those tenants, especially in targeted neighborhoods. And then facilitators, that's what I call United Ways, 211s, continuums of care. Some of you are the continuum of care. Make sure you're talking to your own agency, especially counties. Sometimes one county agency not talking to another. So work with all the facilitators. Your current homeless system. Some people are going to get evicted. Make sure you know how to use existing rapid rehousing dollars and other HUD dollars, how to use those for those that don't wind up getting the help through their crisis wraparound services. And your judges, your chief judges, your judicial system. Your eviction collaborative might not look exactly like this, but I encourage you to build a collaborative. Take your time, even if it takes a little bit of time, putting together a collaborative, it will benefit you. Please, 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 everyone out there, listen to, I got 4 minutes left, but listen to this one more time. Please do not put out a lottery system that has no targeting, that's first come, first serve, and does not have any income, especially with that 50% AMI and less target. Please don't do that. I'm begging you. It seems some in your community will say, well, that's the fair thing to do. That is the least fair thing to do. Both Diane, Barbara would agree to that. We will help you. We have a program coming up where we are going to be taking 6 weeks and coaching a bunch of communities on this. It's going to start February the 3rd. If you're interested in our 6-week eviction coaching program, we're going to teach you how to use data to shape your strategy, look for your new system, building the collaborative resources with landlords. February the 3rd, we're starting our new round of a collaborative coaching, 6 weeks. You don't have a lot of time, and you're going to be doing this while we coach, but you can go to rethinkinghomelessness.org to get more information. Again, if you have questions beyond this webinar, you can go to info@rethinkinghomelessness. And so if you have other questions, we would love to answer them. Let me just answer a couple more quick questions. Again, I'm Andre Bailey with Rethinking Homelessness. 2 more minutes left. Thank you for being patient. Kathleen in Peru City was asking about Indiana. City government official asking about how city governments should work with agencies like United Way, 211 and their continuum of care. I cannot, I'm biased because I'm a huge fan of using the public sector, private sector, and independent sector to make a problem like this happen. All of you on here are government. We have hundreds of cities and counties on here right now. You guys are fantastic, but lean on your nonprofits, especially United Ways and 211s and continuum of care agencies and others like them. You got some money, pay those folks to help you carry this burden of targeting and getting this money out. So Kathleen, I encourage you, use that 10% and use it to partner with these groups. Use United Ways to partner with landlords and reach out to landlords. Roberta in Adams, Wisconsin, Mayor Mayor of Adams, Wisconsin. Mayor, thank you for being on. How can local government work with national homeless organizations? So critical that you take the time to understand the funding that's coming down from HUD. The continuum of care process was just extended to where continuums of care don't even have to reapply this year. Whatever funding your community got from HUD in the NOFA process is automatically coming again this year. Make sure you understand what those funds are, Mayor, because you want to be able to try to prevent eviction for so many. But if it doesn't work out, a landlord refuses, you want to be able to then have other resources ready and to assist those families. So again, thank you so much. I encourage, with the last 60 seconds, I just want to again thank Diane from the National Low Income Housing Coalition, Diane Yentel, she is fantastic. Barbara Poppe, former USICH czar, homeless czar, she was amazing. We're going to send you all the links that Barbara Poppe talked about in a follow-up email. Diane Yentel's follow-up links, we're going to send those as well. New information they put out today, we're going to get you that. And I just want to encourage you guys, if you are interested in 6 weeks, we don't have 6 months, 6 weeks of coaching. We have a program that we're offering starting February 3rd. It's very inexpensive, and it's something that can help you. We're going to one-on-one coach you on how to do this. Thank you so much, Andre Bailey with Rethinking Homelessness. We are, it's our pleasure to serve you. And on behalf of all those, last thought, on behalf of, Last thought for all of the leaders out there, mayors, county leaders, you have so many families, children, who are depending on you right now. This $25 billion, however much of it that winds up in your community, this is for some of these folks, this is their only lifeline to avoid homelessness, especially homelessness for many of them for the first time. They've never experienced homelessness. So I want to thank you on their behalf for putting the time, the energy, for putting the work into the homeless prevention program that you're doing. It's meaningful work, and with all that you're doing with COVID-19, with all that you're doing in the community right now, thank you. Keep up the hard work. In the next few months, we feel like there's going to be some big solutions coming, and we're just privileged to help you. If you're interested in our 6-week program, reach out to us. We'd love to help you. Andre Bailey, CEO of Rethinking Homelessness, thank you again for joining us, and we will be reaching back out to you soon.